Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. The question for today is what role consciousness plays in action. We usually think that conscious decision is necessary before doing any kind of action, any kind of deliberate action. And there may be some reason to wonder whether this is really the case. The question of the role of consciousness in action relates to the long-standing problem of free will and determinism. This is one of the classic problems in philosophy and has generated a lot of vexed questions in undergraduate philosophy students like you, so enjoy. The question is whether our actions are free or whether they're determined by physical forces. And the answer to the question depends, as much of the answer does in philosophy, on how you define the terms. So starting with determinism, we can think of determinism as every physical event being the inevitable result of prior physical events and laws. So from the beginning of time, it was determined that you would be watching this video. It was determined that I was going to be making this video. So all of the events previous to this have led up to this particular moment. You didn't skip watching this video, you were determined by this video. And here the idea of physical causation is that causation is complete, that from the beginning of time, that set of events absolutely determine the next set of events, which absolutely determine the next, and so forth and so on. And this is a notion of physical causation that we get from Newton, where we establish the laws of physics and they are unexceptioned, and therefore we have full determinism, full physical determinism. And we saw with Descartes that that was one of his motivations. This idea of physical determinism was one of Descartes' motivations for establishing the mind as separate from the body, so that the mind could still be free, the mind could still cause action. And so, the question is, where do we stand now with this idea of physicalism and this idea of determinism? But it's also important to notice in the history of philosophy that physical determinism was not the only kind of determinism that caused this question of free will versus determinism, because you can also think of full causation as being divine rather than physical. So there was a notion of God in medieval philosophy as omnipotent and as completely causing all of the events in the world to happen as they happened. God knows everything, God does everything, and so then there was, even before Newton, this question of how do humans have the capacity of acting? How can we be responsible for our actions if God's causing everything? So, whether you're a religious person and believe that God is fully in control, or whether you believe that physical causation is completely in control, you have this question of how could there be free will? How could you cause anything if these other forces are entirely determined? Alternatively, you might think that causation is probabilistic. You might think that indeterminism is true. We now have a new way of thinking about the ultimate physical relations since Einstein overturned or supplemented what Newton talked about in terms of causation, in terms of physical causation. We now know that there is this quantum level of indeterminist causation. And that may lead you to think that, okay, everything's fixed. Free will is just indeterministic. But if you think about what indeterminism is, it's just randomness. And randomness isn't really what we want in free will. So that leads us to the next definition that we have to talk about, the definition of free will. And ultimately what we want out of a definition of free will is the idea that mental states cause action. We want our decisions, we want our ways of thinking about things to cause us to do things. You want it to be because you decided, you were motivated to watch this video, that you're watching this video, and I'm certainly motivated to create this video. So we want those motivations, we want those thought processes. I want to be a good teacher, I want to provide this material to my students, and that's part of my identity, that's part of who I am, And I want that to be what causes my actions in order to really have something that's meaningful in terms of my free will and in terms of responsibility. So this is the other aspect of free will that's really important, is this idea that our free will is what makes us responsible for things. If somebody just knocks me over and then I knock somebody else over, then I'm not responsible for knocking that second person over because I didn't have any control over, this process. So it wasn't an action of mine. It wasn't a controlled action of mine. And so I can be responsible for that. So this is a fundamental question of free will, is, what makes us responsible for the things that we do. The libertarians think that in order to have true free will, then we need to have something that is an action that we could have done or could have not done that action. So for the libertarians, it can't be that physical causation is the source of an action, that it needs to be something where in doing the action, I could have done the action or I could have not done the action. And this we'll see is a very, very strong view of what constitutes free will. The libertarian thinks that free will is such that if we have it, determinism must be false. It must be that free will escapes this causal physical force from the beginning of time. So they are in the category of incompatibilism, that determinism is incompatible with free will. Similarly, the determinists are incompatibilists. They believe that determinism is true and therefore free will is necessarily an illusion, and we're better off just getting rid of that illusion of free will and recognizing that the forces of physical causation entirely determine events. That's a pretty hard position to take. That's why they're called the hard determinists, because of all of these other consequences of giving up free will. And it seems like we give up moral responsibility. The hard determinists argue that we don't, that we can still talk about responsibility and still hold people responsible. But it gets difficult to see why that's the case, and it gets difficult to see how anything works with determinism being the case, because it from the conscious perspective, it doesn't seem like it's the case. Searle has this great joke about determinism, that even if determinism is true, you still need to decide what you're going to have for lunch. You can't just go into a restaurant and sit down, and when they ask you what you want to eat, say, well, it's determined that what I'm going to have, because the server still isn't going to know what to serve you. So you still at some point have to make decisions, even if it's determined from the beginning of time. So that leads to the compatibilist position, and they're called soft determinists because they believe that every action is inevitable. They believe that determinism is true, but they still think that mental states cause action. Soft compatibilists tend to be materialists, so that they think that mental states are part of the physical world, and so when you go into that restaurant and you decide that you're going to have tomato soup for lunch, that is your mental state doing the action, even though it was determined from the beginning of time that you would choose tomato soup, that you would be watching this video. It's still your choice to do it, in the sense that your mental state is your brain state and it's having this effect on you. And how they reconcile the physical determinism with your mental states also causing action is the idea that action is unpredictable. So, you can't guess what you're going to order for lunch. The server can't guess what you're going to order for lunch. Decision making is a very complex thing. It's one of the reasons that the actions are unpredictable, that various different kinds of factors are going on into that decisions, environmental factors and other brain states interacting with one another. And so it's a very, very complex process that can't be predicted, and so your actions can't be predicted. And so because of this complexity, it seems to us that we are responsible for things, and so we can hold ourselves responsible, we can hold other people responsible, because there's no other way for us to operate in the world.